Talk about now some political trends that were going on among nations. We mentioned economic trends. We mentioned industrialization, obviously, communication changes. We mentioned travel or transportation, but now political trends. One of the major trends of the 19th century is something we call nationalism. And nationalism is what we refer to as extreme pride in one's country. You can see the image here. Hopefully, you laugh a little bit at the America, the bald eagle drinking some light beers, which is a little bit on the funny side if you ask me. But nationalism is extreme pride in one's country. And that's something that all nations tended to believe that they were bigger and better than everyone else. And there's, to some extent, that still exists today. In the United States, think about this. If you ask people, what's the best country to live in, they always tell you America, even though they never lived anywhere else. All right. That's the belief that we do it better here in the United States than anyone else. And a large number of countries still have this today, and many countries had this in the 19th century. Many nations had a lot of scientific development, military accomplishments, political achievements, and so they believe that they're the best. And that's not necessarily a bad thing all the time. But we're going to tell you later on why it could potentially be a bad thing. So, nationalism is one of our big trends of the 19th century. And one of the other big trends was what we call imperialism. Right? Imperialism is the exploitation of a smaller country by a larger country. To give you some context as to potentially why that is or what that's about, think of it as in terms of what school teaches you. It's like bullying. Larger countries bully smaller countries for a number of reasons. And we want to talk about those reasons for colonization. Now, colonization or imperialism, or where a larger country exploits a smaller country, and in many instances, they send their military there and they are going to take over or colonize that particular land. That means turn it into a colony or like a form of their own country, kind of like a state within a nation. Now, the reasons that they would do this. Every country had different reasons for engaging in imperialism, but one of the biggest reasons, and one of the reasons that's always going to transpire, or one of the reasons that's always going to be a thing, is for natural resources. And this is in part connected to industrialization. Those factories that were needed in order to get a jump on business from other countries and competitors, those factories needed more raw materials. And many of the European countries who have industrialized at this point, and the United States, needed additional materials to make those machines work and to create finished products. So natural resources is going to be one of the major reasons why anyone colonizes. And you can see here with this particular map, imperialism, the victims of this are going to be countries who are lesser developed. And for Europe, Africa is going to be the area that gets colonized the most heavily. You can see here by 1914, almost all of Africa has been carved up into different locations by different European nations. Very few nations, you can see there that for a while, what we call Eritrea today, or Ethiopia and Libya, have managed to maintain their independence, but it wouldn't always be that way. Africa they have tons of natural resources that Europeans want. There's a great deal of oil in northern Africa, gold, diamonds, tungsten, tons of different precious metals. In many instances, there are certain exotic fruits or other foodstuffs. Yes, I like that word, foodstuffs, that they can't always get in Europe, or it's at least more accessible. So natural resources is one of the reasons that European nations are going to engage in imperialism. But it wasn't just that as well. Natural resources are great, but once you put those through factories and you create finished goods or finished products, Africa was a place where the Europeans could market the things that they made. So not only are they going to rob these African regions of natural resources, take those resources back to Europe, and then make finished goods, but they're going to try to sell it to them as well. That seems a little messed up for sure. Okay, but not only that, imperialism, the reasons: number one, obviously you want natural resources, you want a marketplace. Another reason, cheap labor. Extracting the raw materials from the earth can be very dangerous, and European nations would use local labor in order to do that. Slave labor. You don't have to pay them anything. So, unfortunately, many of these people in Africa are not only going to have their land pillaged, but they are going to be uh, the victims of brutal violence in order to get those materials in itself. Also, in your folder, you're going to find a video that we'll watch in class, and if you weren't there, you can watch it about Belgium's exploitation of the Congo, which is particularly brutal. Okay, so reasons for colonizations: you get a marketplace, you get the materials, you get cheap labor, and not only that, this gave a place for European nations to invest. One of the things in which they would do is invest the capital or the money that they had into building things like railroad networks and transportation systems in order to get those materials out of there. And they would use this as an excuse in many instances. So countries would exploit Africa and say, well, we are building them railroads. And in many instances, they would build schools or bring medicine as well. But the value of that compared to the raw materials they were taking out was absolutely horrendous. Europeans were definitely getting the better of these particular circumstances. Another reason for imperialism: religion. Okay? Many Christian nations in Europe believed they had to spread the gospel to African nations. People in Africa needed to hear about Jesus. The Europeans said, we're saving these people's souls. The least they could do is give us something in return. Can you really put a price tag on somebody's everlasting soul? And Europeans simply said, no, we can't. And ultimately, there were some Christian missionaries who wanted to genuinely try to help people in Africa, but in many instances, Christianity, the spread of Christianity or religion, was simply a front for the economic pillaging of Africa and other places around the world. Connected somewhat to religion, some nations thought that they had a duty to civilize African people. They said that Africans were backward, they didn't have the clothing, the education, the skills necessary to make it in a modern world. They didn't know how to govern themselves, and they needed Europeans to come in and bring them up to a level where they needed to be. Okay, so two of our political trends we have mentioned so far: nationalism and imperialism. Okay, we'll get to the other ones in our next particular videos, but one thing to think about too, question for you to consider: does imperialism still go on today? Think it over.